Hello? Okay. So yes, the clinic, it's an overtly communist organization which aims to make long-term psychoanalytic psychotherapy accessible to those who want it, while developing a clinical practice that can incorporate thinking about the social, the economic, and the political, while also, as we write in our manifesto, honing psychotherapy into a better weapon for the communist movement. In keeping with this mission, we are honored to present this event featuring two of the most unflinching voices for Palestine. Lara and Stephen Sheehi's Psychoanalysis Under Occupation is, among other things, a scathing critique of psychoanalytic innocence that disavows reality under the cover of balance or both sides and other equivocations, and so is complicit in the reality bending of settler colonial powers. Now, there's been quite a strong reaction to this event, and we had an event last night at the Freud Museum up in London. From various nefarious quarters have objected to our holding this, and we'd like to thank the Friends Meeting House for being steadfast in the event is being recorded, so please don't record yourself. And we have a couple of hours, so we'll have our speakers speak, and then there'll be plenty of time for questions and comments.
هاي folks, أهلا وسهلا بالجميع وشكرا لوجودكم. أنا اسمي لارا شيحة. Hey folks, my name is Lara Sheehi, and we just want to start off by thanking everybody for being here, for coming out. I know there was a protest also, so if some of you went there and then came here, also thank you so much. You know, credit where credit is due. First and foremost, thank you to the Red Clinic, Luke and Asrar, for all the work that you've done to make this possible. This is our first time here in Brighton. We've been to London many times. This is the first time visiting here. So thank you so much for creating a space for us, including us, inviting us into your community, and all the labor that's behind the scenes that makes these things happen. There's so many details. And then put on top of it a fascist push to intimidate, to harass, to silence, to make sure that people are disciplined themselves and discipline others, and a sort of alignment with the political commitment, whether it's the Friends Meeting House or the Red Clinic or everybody who showed up today. Despite that, we don't take that lightly, and we thank you for that very much. Again, shout out also to the Friends Meeting House. I've been following your events online and seeing what are the things that you're doing. So I just want to thank you for your solidarity to Palestine. Thank folks in the room for your solidarity with Palestine, and also with trans and queer liberation. I'm just so grateful to be in community with you around that and to bring these things together. What we're seeing today is a global movement. It's a movement that's a coalitional movement, and what we haven't seen in a long time: an anti-war movement, a pro-Palestine movement, movement for Black lives, a labor movement, a students movement. And I think that's part of what locates us. When we talk about Sumud today, it also emerges from that. What does it mean to have a praxis of solidarity? And what does that mean in the context also of mental health and of course, emanating from Palestine and from our siblings in Gaza? So I'm gonna pass it along to Stephen, who will start us off, locate and frame, and then I will end. And we really hope that this will be a conversation today. So our interventions are typically, we're not typically, you know, boring 20, 30, 45-minute lectures that as though we're coming from high and sort of disseminating knowledge to the contrary. We take every opportunity to try and create knowledge on the ground with the folks that we're lucky enough to come in contact with. So we hope that you will also take this opportunity to help us go deeper today. So once we're done speaking, we really invite you all to bring in, whether it's questions or comments or things that we might be struggling with. If there's nothing else that we need, it's communal solidarity and to be together thinking through the questions that are harder to think when fascists are knocking at the door. So hopefully here today we can sort of think together, bring our brains together, but also our hearts. This is affective work, and our interventions are also very deeply respectful of that. So we invite that in as well, and there'll be plenty of time for us to be together in that space. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I also just want to very briefly, before I start, riff off of Lara, and again, thank you all for being here. It's, I think it's a Saturday, I've lost track of time, but in the West, that's actually a holiday for you day, so I appreciate it. So taking your time to come out and show up for Palestine. And I also just want to thank Luke and Asrar and the Red Clinic for all the organization that they've been doing. They're just amazing. And of course, the meetings, the Friends Meeting House, which I'm Lebanese, but I was born and raised in Philadelphia, which was it's a settler colonial city that was founded by Quaker William Penn, who is actually right in the middle of the city. Has a mixed sort of history, but growing up, the Friends have always been friends of, the Quakers have always been friends of the Palestinian people, and it's been a touchstone of support in white supremacist society in which I had to grow up. So I guess that, in other words, it's the place where, you know, the good white people were. So I just want to appreciate it, or acknowledge being in this space. Am I not speaking loud enough? Okay, that's very rarely heard. Or slower? Slower. Okay, my Philadelphia accent. That was really slow, Philadelphia. Okay. I'm going to say goodbye to you now and put my reading glasses on, and I won't be able to see you, but you'll be able to see me. Again, and I just, you know, I think we were invited to kind of talk about the book, and I think Lara and I just kind of wanted to make something more current. And so this is something I'm going to read. Forgive me, and I hate having a computer between it. It's like we have enough stuff between us. Like when the Friends Meeting House, stuff between us in our world. So I hate having computers between us, and I hate reading off the computers. But I hope you indulge me. The world should know about these children who were murdered in Israel by Israel, because they are not numbers, but names, stories, and dreams killed by the Israeli occupation in Gaza. Contemplating the unfathomable world in which our children are forced to live, Sarah Khalidi was horrified by and initially rejected the idea of writing the names of her 4 children on their limbs in order to be identified in case they were bombed and mutilated. Yet in escaping from Gaza City to Khan Yunis, she, like other Palestinian parents, such as Muhammad Abu Adey, concluded, this is Muhammad, writing my children's names on their bodies is the solution so that they are not just numbers, but that the world will know them, unquote. The writing of names on the living bodies of Palestinian children in Gaza leads me to discussions within psychoanalysis about how our personalities, our interior worlds, our personal and social relations are built through passing information, social and psychological messages, and social knowledge, both true and imagined, between generations. How feelings of safety, security, paranoia, or anxiety, or safety are passed between parents and children, and how, quote, good objects and good attachments are formed, and how interpersonal objects are also sociogenic objects, as Fanon would say, emerging from the larger fabric of their communities. To be more concrete, the writing of names on living Palestinian children's bodies transformed their bodies under colonialism from the helpless target of murder to a site of Palestinian life, to a site of reproducing social meaning, a site where death and liberation are interlocked as imminent potentials. In our book, Lara and I discuss a series of cases of suicide in Gaza, the West Bank, and occupied Jerusalem. The life and death of Basil al-Araj, a revolutionary intellectual who, hunted as a fugitive for months by the Israeli occupation army, was murdered in cold blood after he ran out of ammunition and after he decided to fight while being apprehended. Or Muhammad Yunus, a promising writer in Gaza with an abusive father who committed suicide after prohibited from leaving Gaza by the Israeli occupation regime to pursue his studies in Jerusalem, where he had won a scholarship for his writing. As a side note, only 10 days before October 7th, last year, Muhammad al-Najjar, another young acclaimed poet, completed a suicide, debilitated by the depression from his loss of his father and his own failure, he felt, of his work. In coupling Basil and Muhammad's lives, writings, and deaths allowed us to place suicide and murder and state-sponsored murder alongside the willfulness of living and dying. It allowed us to challenge victimization, trauma, and set it alongside agenic defiance. It's important to note, I think, at this, just as a side, the Palestinian martyr Aaron Bushnell. Who deserves a mention in this thinking of willful death. A martyrdom that is not lost. We sit painfully with that gesture of sacrifice and solidarity, without any sense of romanticism that would deflect from its horror. We witness how he and his love moved people under genocide. Adjacent to the stories of Muhammad and Basil al-Arash, a vignette of Palestinian parents tagging their children as living stories and dreams redirects us from Gaza's previous condition of slow death, as Jasbir Pawar describes, to the incendiary necroscape of the current genocide. From the assumption of the settler colonial omnipresence to the denuded fragility of colonial control exposed by the heroicism on October 7th. Within this cleavage, the parents of Gaza present us with the Palestinian anti-colonial practice of livability, as Nader Kevorkian would say, a practice of sumud. These practices make me consider make me ask, what is passed between and within Palestinian generations in order to bind them together as individuals, as kin, both chosen and filial, as communities, and as a national identity, thereby also buttressing them against the eliminatory technologies and logics and genocidal goals of Zionism. The names of Basil al-Arash, Muhammad Yunus, and Aaron Bushnell mix with the Palestinian Munadilin and Munadilat, who have been martyred because they refuse to accept the asphyxiatory control of Zionism. Psychoanalysis might teach us that parents, community members, and even the resistance engage in reverie for children and for each other, subjected to the sheer unmetabolizable volume of violence around them. This reverie, as Wilfred Bion teaches us, opens a psychic space to hold and contain the overwhelming nature, often terrifying nature, of reality, where parents interpolate the reality back onto the children in ways that allow them not to be overpowered and psychically debilitated by it. So it's kind of the parent holding the fear for the child and reintroducing reality to them so they feel held. Initially refusing the register of potential death of their children's lives on their limbs, we witness the anguish of parents morph into a holding and containment of what Christopher Bolus would call the unthought known. And in this case, the unthought known certainly is one of a violent uncertainty for the child. Nader Shalhoub-Borkian shows us that Palestinians, quote, speaking life to death in practices of samud and revolutionary love in communities, in prisons, in schools, and even in hospitals and in the streets. Acts of holding and containment, of reverie, are wired into the complex social practice of samud, stalwartness. This reverie is not limited to the interpersonal. It is a psychosocial process of Palestinians creating a psychic space for one another against the eliminatory logic of settler colonialism in Palestine, otherwise known as Zionism. The Palestinian resistance itself, its long tradition, especially since 1967, provides a psychic source of reverie, a holding and containment of pain and suffering in the struggle. The resistance becomes a place where the psychic space is open to hold affirming good objects of Palestinian selfhood in the face of genocidal erasure. On November 24th last year, Hanan Barghouti was released after 3 months of illegal detention without charge from an Israeli gulag. She is the sister of Nail, the longest serving Palestinian political prisoner for 30 years in the gulag, and the sister of the political prisoner Omar Barghouti, who has been in jail for 30 years, and the mother of 4 sons, all of whom remain in the Israeli gulags under administrative detention with no charges of trial. Upon her release, Emma Imad, as she is known, describes the debasing conditions and degrading treatment of female prisoners in the by the apartheid jailers since October 7th. She says, "We were living in isolated confinement, shut off from the world. Sometimes the women prisoners would come in and give us news. Sometimes we would get that news from small transistor radios. Every night they'd come in and take the radio. They'd beat us. They'd spray us with gas. Because we were proud and strong. We were deprived of food and drink, but our food and drink were the people of Gaza. Our food was the people of Gaza. Our drink were the people of Gaza. We were deprived of air, but the air of Gaza reached us with joy and dignity and absolute pride in the resistance. From the smallest child, we embrace them all, the resistance and the people of Gaza. With the warmest salutations, we welcome them. God reward their goodness. If it were not for the people of Gaza, we would not have seen freedom. We were inside the prison. The jailers were sadists. They insulted us and humiliated us, but our pride is high and our dignity is elevated thanks to the resistance. The resistance did not only free these illegally detained women and children from the apartheid gulag. News of the resistance of all Gazans, whether received via women prisoners or small transistor radios, passed messages of love and containment. The news of the resistance held and contained these incarcerated women's suffering under Israeli torture and abuse. It made them strong, and it gave them clarity, and it affirmed their humanity in the face of dehumanizing brutality. If the settler colonial ideology forecloses the imagining of better and more just worlds, the reverie of the Palestinian elders, ancestors, and siblings in the resistance and in the Zionist Gulag works to ensure not only perseverance, but also the continuity of the Palestinian people. Reverie holds the promises of the future, and reverie holds the promises of the future through the presence of the resistance. Reverie holds the assurance that Palestine will be free.
I feel the affect, I'm feeling it, and I certainly am attuned to it in the room as well. So again, thank you for being in this space with us. Stephen mentioned Bassel al-Araj, who was known as the engaged intellectual, the revolutionary intellectual, and much more beloved revolutionary militant and teacher, and that's why he was targeted. So in honor of him and his words also, and just sort of, I think a lot about how do we hold, and this is part of why we wanted to talk about sumud today, the practice of how does one sustain the will to live and resist and remain steadfast in the face of such unthinkable violence. And for me, he's one of the main figures when we think about that. So in honoring that, sumud also includes recognizing the pain and the affect, as Stephen was saying, but also recognizing the beauty in the world. And that is the will to live, to not have our ability to attune to everything that's beautiful, and to remember that our fight for liberation is one that is underscored by a commitment to revolutionary love, right? A love for a world in which we can all live together, not in a sort of like all lives matter type thing, but truly in a world that sustains life, right? So I want to start off with his words that helped me remember that alongside all this pain and suffering, especially as somebody who's a clinician, that there's also a commitment to seeing the beautiful. So these words are from him, and I hope we can hold it in mind as we sort of unpack a little bit more about what sumud looks like technically and on the ground. So he says, you, the academically inclined, set your sights on disenchanting all things by defining and explaining, reckoning that it will land you on the truth. In these overcast days, I tell you, I need no explanatory framework for rainfall, whether it's Thor's hammer or God's mercy or meteorologists' consensus. I want none of it. What I want is my unabating wonder and my silly smile whenever the rain falls, every time as if the first time, a child bewitched and the magic of the world. And so from there, I go straight to Gaza and the kids with the kites, and the kid that would not let go of his kite the other day because he wanted to hold on to it. And I'm hoping that all of us can commit to that sort of enchantment as we also take in the affect. I'm one of the shrinks in the room. I think there are others here. And rather than sort of misplaced fantasies about what being a shrink means, in the context of Eurocentric practice, it actually often means relentlessly beating off carceral logics of psychoanalysis, right? Speaking to how much it has harmed almost everybody, including particularly minoritized folks in general, and then discussing how we move to a decolonial and liberatory praxis. So here, when I'm thinking about Sumud through this lens and through my own clinical work, I'm also drawing on Che Guevara's idea about despecialization. So I hope that in some ways what our talk does is also despecialize, right? Take it out of expert mode and say, what is it that we can do together to understand, and then use psychoanalysis like the Red Clinic commits to for revolutionary times, and then take up what Stephen has laid out for us and operationalize it. How do we use it? How do we make it work for us? How do we help it sustain us in this struggle? This has already been a long struggle. And for folks who live in the world as racialized or gendered subjects, or subjects that are class subjects that are sort of subject to the daily violences of the state or the world, we know what it's like to feel tired. And so how do we sustain ourselves in that? How do we make it of use? Both in terms of what's happening psychically, but also that people continue to make life and resist under unthinkable conditions and without romanticization, of course. And then also for us to work together through this. This is not an easy task, so maybe again in the Q&A we can think of that and ask and think and really sit with what it means to have Gaza be our food and water, as Hanan said. What it means to practice Sumud as a means of warding off psychic intrusion. And when I say that, I'm also saying the psychological operations that are central to violent systems, that are central to sustaining a genocide that has been going on for months and months and months. Part of the warfare is, yes, on the ground, but also it invites all of us to be engaged in this psychological process, right? That would have us sort of have to fight and qualify that this is a genocide, to sit there and worry about if we wear a kufi, to have us worry that we say the word Palestine. These are psychological operations, and so I'm also interested in Sumud as a practice of warding that off. So the questions I've been thinking about for some time include how we can seize psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic praxis, using it to resist these psychic intrusions in fascist times. And we are in fascist times, right? When you have what are they called? The lawyers, the UK lawyers for Israel, send an email to the Freud Museum or to the Friends Meeting House and say, we're in possession of these emails, and say, cancel the event and tell me it's canceled, right? With impunity. These are practices of fascism, right? Of sort of brute force that relies on people feeling scared enough to cave. And for me, it seems that nothing's more urgent in the moment to sustain our fight, yes, for a free Palestine, but also for our collective liberation. How do we use Sumud to center Palestine and speak life, as Nadira teaches us, versus even unwittingly centering the settler colonial regime, its death machine, and its settlers? So a lot of time when we're talking about these things, we sometimes over-focus on the violent machinery rather than center the people who are showing us their will to live, centering Palestine. It's really hard to follow what Stephen just laid out for us again without moving us away from the affect, right? So I want to, again, invite us to stay there. It feels life-sustaining. It's a life-sustaining fire that Hanan leaves us with, right? Her words leaves us with that fire, and I kind of want to center us from there and move out of it. Both as a political necessity, to feel that affect, to feel the pain, to register her words, to register what it truly means that she's saying this as a political prisoner who's just released, to model for us. So let me repeat her words again, just to ground us further, and to remind us that what we're working toward is not abstract. It's real, right? And that when we speak of abolition, when we speak of freedom dreaming, like Robin Kelly tells us, or when we enact the decolonial now, we're not thinking about futures. This is what we're taught to do. We're always thinking about what comes after, rather than thinking about what are the things we're doing right now, right? Even in this space coming together, is this a way also to disrupt that machinery that would have us believe that we're actually not able to do anything? So let me go again to Hanan's words, and these are her words. We were deprived of food and drink, but our food was the people of Gaza. Our drink was the people of Gaza. We were deprived of air, but the air of Gaza reached us with joy, dignity, and with absolute pride in the resistance. Gaza reached us with joy, dignity, and absolute pride. I've heard, and I'm sure you all have heard too, that how some of these things are quote unquote mere slogans. People try to sort of defang them and say these are just slogans, the things we chant in the streets, this idea of being joyful or proud. Apart from actually believing as a clinician, again, with the affective power, that slogans are actually really important. They're important especially for psychic clarity and affective identifications, right? And the way that things or objects, as Stephen was talking about, get lodged inside of us, they animate themselves and they do the work through us. So there's something actually deeply important about holding on to slogans. And so these words, Hanan's words, are very important for us too. They're affective guides, they're emotional guides for us, right? They relate to and emanate from sumud, joy, dignity, and absolute pride, right? To set us, relocate us there. Here, when we hear it in those ways, sumud emerges as the space where together spaces of livability, life, not just death, despite the ever-increasing chokeholds and enclosure systems that are constitutive to Zionist settler colonial regime. This did not start in October, right? Settler colonialism is built on asphyxiation. And so that's the concept of sumud, where it comes as a space where how do we create spaces of life despite the ever-increasing, right? We see how it increases in its chokeholds. It becomes even more severe. When we were learning alongside folks across Palestine for the book that we learned that sumud in the clinical space, just as in the street and in the home, is not stagnant, right? And importantly, in the work of in the world of psychology, or even pop psychology, it doesn't work for the maintenance of Palestinian resilience. It's not about resilience, right? Resilience as being the constant state of adapting to ever more pressing and violent conditions, rather than disrupting the structures that would create those conditions to begin with, right? When we task people with resilience, we're saying that you are constantly having to up your game, right? Rather than saying, actually, no, poverty's not, we can't have poverty. We don't have people adapt to ever-increasing class chokeholds, right? And the idea when thinking in those ways and thinking in structures of eliminating the conditions that created the suffering to begin with, we start to realize that sumud is a practice of liberation. It's a practice of national liberation, in the way that Robin Kelly reminds us of the revolutionary intentionality of this phrase. Again, oftentimes taken as just a slogan, but when we locate it within a liberation movement, we can think about Palestinians not just as legitimate victims, right? But as willful subjects that are building the future from the present, as Robin Kelly tells us. And for this, we need to remember, especially with the onslaught of violence, both in its genocidal form in Gaza, and it's also its violent carceral logic across the rest of Palestine. Hanan is not from Gaza, right? Hanan is a political prisoner in Palestine. This is across Palestine. And of course, its fascistic forms here in the Imperial Center, or the settler colony Big Brother of the United States, that we have to think about it, that sumud actually is an important concept for all of us to be able to sustain life under conditions that would have us actually submit to the violence. Again, emanating from the settler colony into the imperial core. That settler colony cannot be sustained if it weren't for this imperial core and the other imperial core where we usually live. And this is where the code of psychoanalysis comes into play. So when I'm thinking as a psychoanalytic clinician, I'm thinking, folks don't go to therapy initially when psychoanalysis was thought through. Folks don't go to therapy 3 to 5 times a week because they're that bad off, but because of an understanding that psychoanalysis is a relational process, one that you dedicate time to working through, a sustained commitment to that process, right? And what the potential to shift when you sit in relationship with it, that is sort of how, if we're thinking about sumud as an indigenous practice, it's one that is centered in a relational practice that says there's a commitment to time, to space, to relationality, to us understanding that these things deserve a space to work through, right? And not just to maintain the function of the oppression, but also to liberate oneself from that. Muhammad al-Fanoon, who's a prisoner in the 1970s, talked about sumud in this way, and he said, and this is a quote, "Its roots grow, bloom, and deepen like a living entity, and it's nourished by every preceding experience from sumud in every previous stage of interrogation in Zionist prisons, and it's nourished by the willpower and revolutionary fervor," right? This is what we mean by it's not stagnant. We often have this idea, particularly as leftists, that everything that didn't work was a failure, rather than as a rehearsal for the next time around when we seize the moment. And this concept of sumud actually helps us, because if sumud is always building on what came before, building the future from the present, then it also transforms all of the times that we attempted and it quote unquote didn't work into a time that actually did work and built another space from which to emerge, another moment from which we can move forward with. So when we think about it this way, we can also begin to inoculate ourselves against this wear and tear from witnessing such brazen atrocities, right? Ghassan Abu Sitta, if you all have probably been following him, he was there and doing surgeries on children in Gaza, and we got to sit with him and spend some time with him. And he said that his heart shatters every single day, but still has not, as you know, has committed to this idea of sumud, in as much as instead of identifying living and dying, suffering, we would instead see willfulness. Right? That even in that space where he saw the most unbelievable atrocities, and he would say to us that you can't even imagine everything you're seeing, all those of us who are plugged in to what's happening, that we still can't even imagine. And still there's a willful subjectivity that under Zionist settler colonial violence that has the intent to eliminate, displace, and disappear, that people can sort of commit to an imagining, an enacting and an imagining of how do we create life and sustenance. Many of you might have seen this from photos that we see where our minds work so hard to say the tenderness that we still see from parents, right? The decoration for Ramadan on rubble, people praying on rubble, people sharing food together, cooking for each other, checking in on each other. These are all examples of how one sustains dignity and refuses to have their humanity degraded, despite the fact that that is the intent of the violent machine. So this is a through line I'd like to underscore for us. The through line that would connect us here in Brighton to Hanan, to Gaza, and back again in solidarity together and in fighting for Palestinian liberation. And here again, I want to communicate, because anything I ask folks to do, if I'm asking you to join me in your affect, I also want to join you in that. So I want to make it even more personal here and bring myself fully into the room. I'm speaking to you today as someone who for a year and 4 months has had my every word surveilled by fascists, by right-wing Zionists, or both. They're usually an overlap. And also by liberals, both inside and outside my field. The event today was threatened, like we said, the event yesterday was threatened. They released a press release with my face on it saying that I'm a terrorist, and the Freud Museum yesterday said that if we were to have our event there, that we would have to sign a release saying we are not terrorists. Okay. 3 Arabs have to qualify their humanity to even speak. Right? So, and of course a demand here, which is why it's so important. Again, our presence here is that refusal that we're talking about. And that's why I'm personalizing it here, to say that to show up and to speak and to come together to not take that lightly and to think, oh, what am I here doing? I'm just like one little person in the UK and not doing anything. No, that's the point, right? Is that we're all supposed to be intimidated. I've had death threats sent to me, physical mail, every version of death threat that you'd want to see. I've been called an Amalek, and therefore deserve to be murdered, just like Netanyahu said about Palestinians. Threats of rape, forced deportation from the United States, stripped of my citizenship in general, been called everything under the sun. Stephen has received sexually aggressive language about what he should do to me as my partner to shut me up, right? These are not new. That's not what I'm focusing on. What I want to say instead, why I'm bringing myself into the room as this is, again, the choosing to keep speaking and even speak louder is because not only as my political commitment to Palestine, right, not as a side gig, not as something as I do on the side, but as a centerpiece of what I do and what I commit myself to as a clinician and my ethical imperative to alleviate the suffering of people, right? But also because it's disruptive. Like, who am I in the end? The reason you come after folks is because they're disrupting the going on being of the violent machine, right? Just as Hanan did. And I want to make that connection because there's something so important and so psychically sustaining to us to be disruptive in these ways, to say the things that otherwise are not expected to be said. And here's how I'm connecting this with Hanan. Abuse works on secrecy, right? It expects to be kept in secret. It expects to alienate people. It expects for people to be so afraid that they become atomized from their communities, that they retreat, and then to internalize the violence, to think it's us that's doing something wrong, right? Versus retaining it as external to us. Because what violence wants and power and these sort of oppressive systems want is a trauma without a traumatizer. Everybody wants to talk about trauma, but nobody wants to say where the trauma is coming from, right? And so in my being here today, irrespective of where my face is and where it shows up and all that, is a way to say, is a psychic refusal. It's a modeling that Hanan gives me to say, no, I'm not going to let this happen in silence. To the contrary, I'm going to speak even louder. It's not just a matter of me speaking out loud in this space so we can collectively witness. Witnessing is important, but I want us to take it a step further if we're thinking about Sumud, and really to say it's about talking back, as Bell Hooks teaches us. In naming what was expected not to be named. Violence expects not to be shown. That email was meant to be sent, and nobody was meant to speak about it. Because if you cancel the event, nobody knows, right? This is a commitment to building the future from the present, to enact and insist on reverie. Hanan, as a political prisoner, was meant to be released. And in the confines and contours of liberal humanism, right, good, nice liberals, and let alone fascism, if she were to maintain her legibility as a good subject, as a good Palestinian, she was not supposed to name that it was the resistance that freed her, that freed all of them. She was meant to be released and just say, thank you, I'm out. But she was not supposed to name that who freed her and who ignited a liberatory movement across Palestine and across the world, and who is it that sustains our fight or who we fight for, right? When we speak this type of truth, when we are clear in that, when we speak in this space and then come together, not just as a theoretical exercise, right, but as a practice of refusal. A refusal to stand down, a refusal to bend reality, a refusal to hide, a refusal to deal in secrecy, and a refusal to do the work that stabilizes violence, settler colonial violence, capitalist violence, imperial violence, or liberalism. That's Sumud. Right? I think I'm going to end there, and then open it up.
Would anyone like to say anything, or ask questions, or make any comments?
Thank you very much. I'm not sure I understood everything, to be quite honest, but my understanding of Samud is steadfastness. Is that your, yeah? And you talked about resilience, and you did say there was a difference. And can you explain the difference? Yeah.
Thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to be more clear on that. So, Sumud is actually, in my mind, probably the furthest thing from resilience, primarily because Sumud, in its essence, rejects the notion that there is an adaptation to be had that's located in the individual to conditions of suffering. Whereas resilience would say, oftentimes a lot of the research that comes out about resilience is very rarely about the conditions that create that suffering to begin with. It's just to say, wow, look how resourceful this individual is in being able to still live despite the fact that they can't eat, right? Whereas Sumud actually speaks back to that and says, actually a centerpiece of Sumud is a consistent, clear, militant stance against where the suffering is coming from. And in that clarity, we sustain life. In defiance, not in resilience, right? In defiance of those conditions, we sustain life. So let me give you an example that I think might help further this. Many of you heard about the prisoners who dug out of the most notorious Israeli prison with spoons, right? And within a sort of Zionist framework or anything, what people were saying is that once they were captured after, like, I think the last prisoner was captured after 5 or 6 days. And many of Zionist commentators or that were saying, well, why would you do this? You're going to get punished more, and in the courts we saw that right afterwards. And what these prisoners said is, you don't understand. The concept of resilience doesn't understand the fact that those prisoners spent over a year transforming the spoon into a weapon of liberation, a spoon that otherwise we look at and we would not see its transformative power. And they said, no, I see the power of it. And it wasn't about the fact of whether I'm going to come back and be abused more. It was about the fact that you cannot control my imagination about what is possible. And in the end, I got to see Palestine. Whether it was for 1 day or 3 days or 4 days or 5 days, that's an example of Sumud, right? A refusal to have the violent machine say what's possible and what's not possible and what's important and what's not important, rather than the resilience of incarcerated people to be able to continue to learn reading, I don't know, when they don't have, reading materials available to them. That's what resilience ends up going down. And resilience, in the end, the last thing I'll say about it is it focuses on a liberal notion of how we see subjects and how we want them, how we would love to see them, rather than them in their fullness. And that fullness includes a prison break.